It is now my great pleasure to introduce our guest today, Amanda Janoo, Economics and Policy Lead for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and Fellow at New America. Amanda is an economic policy and systems change expert with over a decade of experience working with governments and international development institutions around the world. Her work aims to build just and sustainable economies through well-being-oriented and participatory policy design processes. Prior to joining the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, WEAll, you may hear us use that acronym as we're chatting, Amanda worked for the UN, for the United Nations, and the African Development Bank as an industrial policy and structural transformation expert. As a Fulbright researcher, she explored the relationship between international trade and employment, and she holds a master's degree from Cambridge University and heralds from the Green Mountain state of Vermont. Welcome, Amanda, and thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for having me, Stephen. And hi, everyone.
And are you in Vermont today?
I am. Yeah, I'm in my apartment in Burlington. The sun is shining. It is very cold, but yeah, it's beautiful out.
Wonderful. I'm here at the Garrison Institute in the Hudson Valley, and I live in Vermont, not far from where you're based right now. And Vermont is where you're from originally. I wasn't born in Vermont, but you were, is that right?
Yeah. I was born on a farm by a midwife, actually, in rural Vermont. So I love that sort of like origin story in a town called South Stratford. But yeah, now I live in the big city of Burlington, and I'm really grateful we get to meet up for coffee sometimes and chat in real life too.
Yeah. And today on this webinar, and that is a classic Vermont being born story. I love that. So I'm curious to hear your story a bit in regards to well-being economies too. Just in your experience, what's the genesis of your work around well-being economies? How did it come about? And what is meaningful for you in this work? So it's two questions. How has it arisen?
Mm.
And what does it mean? And then we can go in any direction from there.
Oh, it's always so hard, right, with these origin stories to understand where to start, what to focus on. I feel grateful when I went to New Zealand to talk with the WEAll hub there. They were saying it's really important to start really with like your family and that sort of contextual background to understand what really drives and motivates you. And so, I was, as I mentioned, grew up in rural Vermont, but my mom was from like small fishing town in Maine, and my dad was from like a bigger city in Malaysia. He came here as an immigrant, and I was homeschooled growing up, really with a like a Baptist sort of Christian community, but my grandmother was Hindu and my grandfather was Catholic, and um, had this sort of like bicultural, rural, a lot of different, maybe spiritual and intellectual and cultural traditions influencing me and my perspectives. But I think one thing I gained pretty early on was this belief that the purpose in life is to be happy and to be of service to others. And that you really can't do one without the other, meaning can't really be happy unless you are being of service to the world. And equally, you can't really be of service unless you're genuinely happy because things will ripple out in ways that are, yeah, unintentional and potentially kind of negative. And I think probably my siblings and I all share that because they both studied psychology. Whereas for me, I was always interested more in sort of the systems and structures that influence our behavior. And maybe that's partially because for no real reason, I just happen to have been born as a generally happy person. I haven't had to struggle so much with mental health or anxiety, and so tend to look out into the world more than maybe as much internally. And I did feel like when I looked around, there were all of these different like social, environmental, political, spiritual, cultural sort of crises, but somewhere towards the center sat the economy. And when I started studying economics, I was just blown away with a lot of the assumptions that they had about our human nature, particularly the idea that we're all individualistic, selfish, competitive, materialistic like entities, because that wasn't really my understanding of myself or of others. As we have aspects of that, but we also have aspects of compassion and cooperation and interdependence and care, and those aspects didn't seem to be reflected at all. And I do think that having been homeschooled helped me, because rather than taking economics and being like, well, this doesn't make sense, so therefore I must be dumb, I was like, wait, I don't agree with this. So let me try to understand like where the origins of these ideas really came from. So I spent a lot of time studying like history of economic thought, political economy, philosophy and economics, like really trying to understand some of the core assumptions. But I was never really that interested in like I have an intrinsic nerdy interest in the theory of the economy, but was more interested in how do you practically change the system so that it encourages and rewards us to be of service to each other as opposed to just like hoarding as much as we can for ourselves. Because I don't think that that'll make you happy, and I don't think it's good for the world. But the sort of animating assumption of contemporary or mainstream neoclassical economics is the idea that everybody taking as much for themselves is going to make everybody else better off, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense. But so for me, I also was, in university during the financial crisis. And so I was studying these things, but the economists and a lot of folks didn't seem to really know how to interpret what was happening within the worldview or framework that they had. And so that really empowered the sort of idea that like the major issue was neoliberalism, that like really needed government to take a more active role in shaping and directing the economy. And so I ended up working in industrial policy for a long time because that was sort of the last bastion against neoliberalism, where governments were supposed to protect and promote certain economic activities relative to others. But this is a long answer, but like in that experience, what I realized was the most important thing you could do was to ask the governments, what were you actually trying to achieve with your this industrial policy, the economic strategy, because that gave you a sense of which types of economic activities you want to support or not. And so for some governments, it was around equity, some it was peace, some it was resilience, right? And so depending on that goal, that influences the optimal design, right, of your economy, but those questions weren't being asked. And that really led me to the Wellbeing Economy Alliance and movement, because that was a whole community of folks who were asking that exact question of what is the purpose of the economy? How do we evaluate its success? And how do we start from a principle that the purpose of the economy should be to improve the well-being of all life. And so flipping that sort of narrative of people and planet are here to serve the economy, which is our current narrative, to recognizing that the economy is here to serve us.
Thank you. I love the blending of experience and observation about human nature with study of economics and how they sometimes align and sometimes tell very different stories.
Hmm.
I'm wondering, just for all of the audience here today, how you would describe economics and economies. We've talked a little bit about there's a difference there in the ending of the book.
Yeah, yeah. So, and I think this is actually a really important distinction to make, because economics tends to be like the theoretical, I think, study of the economy, of its structures and systems, whereas the economy itself is just an aspect of life on this planet. And so we tend to hear the term economy a lot, but it's not often defined. And I wouldn't say, I think there's a clear definition of maybe economics, at least within neoclassical economics, but the economy, the way that I describe it, is just the way we produce and provide for one another. And that is really influenced by our history, our geographies, our cultures, our policies, and many, many other factors. But that system and whether or not we think it's working well or not really depends on what we're trying to achieve.
It just occurred to me that the study of it also depends on the cultures and the traditions and the perspectives of the people maybe who are teaching and leading research efforts as well, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and that I will say that, I've studied a lot of history of economic thought, but it's really just a history of predominantly like Anglo-Saxon, like white men with, some European, maybe Germanic kind of influences as well. So it was only really representative of a very particular cultural paradigm a lot of the time. But I think increasingly, and I'm very happy for this, some of the decolonizing economics movements is helping to amplify and shed light on alternative cultural economic paradigms. I think the issue is just that often they're not described as economic because they already don't align with a construct of the economy that is very much a Western like social construct. And so it's just sort of like, systems of the ways that we interact with one another and the natural world and what we value and why and how we organize the ways that we provide for one another, care for one another, ensure our collective well-being.
I sometimes like to think about, if we asked anybody on the street, can you name an economist who they would maybe say? And
Ooh, yeah.
always
I
like to,
know. Who would
yeah,
you
who would you?
say?
Well, I'd like Eleanor Ostrom. I mean, she was the
Mm,
first female recipient of the Nobel Prize in economics. A lot of her work was with communities who were very much in deep relationship with the land. And she provided a really balancing point of view around the commons and the common good and how people can be in relationship with each other and in the environment in a way that led to very cooperative management of ourselves and what we're doing and how we're interacting with the world. So
mhm.
I think her work on the commons is still really inspiring.
Yeah, she was a genius. Absolutely phenomenal thinker.
I'm wondering about the word well-being, which is in the name of the organization, the Alliance, right? The Wellbeing Economies Alliance. Can you say a little more about some of the dimensions of well-being and how do we know it when we see it?
Yeah. So this is quite huge in terms of a point. And I should say, so the Wellbeing Economy Alliance has emerged about 6 years ago. And I should say that the term well-being economy was kind of just randomly chosen. There's a lot of different terms for this kind of movement, like regenerative economy, care economy, solidarity economy. And, I think there's, hundreds of different sorts of terminology. And I think it was influenced because there was a brilliant sort of thinker, Lorenzo Fiamonte, who was using the term well-being economy. And at the time, it was called, all of these sort of heterodox alternative economic movements were called the new economy, but the well-being economy seemed more directional than just new economy. It was like clear that it was trying to orient, seemed like it resonated and was intuitive with folks. But the idea was always, at least for WEAll, to really act as sort of a picnic blanket. So to be able to connect and support a wide range of different movements within the space, organizations, actors to sort of build the power base that is needed. But I do think there is a broader well-being sort of policy movement as well, which intersects importantly here, which is sort of grounded in how are we defining national progress and societal success. And so that also was very much started to accelerate after the financial crisis. Particularly, there was a group of a Beyond JDP with like Stiglitz and others that were really trying to advance new definitions. I know that Sarkozy, like the French prime minister at the time, was interested in it because he was inspired by Bhutan's gross national happiness framework to see if maybe if you redefine progress, maybe away from just how much are we producing or the value of economic output, if France would look better. Yeah. In terms of like, there's always these sort of like political things. And honestly, it is important to, again, to recognize that this is often what matters for well-being or how we articulate what matters for well-being. There are variances across spaces and contexts, but I would say when I ask people what they love about where they live, 9 times out of 10, they talk about their community and about the natural environment. And that's usually the starting point for me to say, okay, well, then why aren't those the things that are being prioritized in our decision making? If that's what you love most and value most, right? I like just grounding it there. And so I think across a variety of different national governments, frameworks, communities, sort of definitions of well-being, you do tend to always see at least those dimensions of, issues of how are people doing, right? Like, and also issues of equity are almost always there. So how is the sort of drivers of well-being, as you might say, the things that matter most for our well-being distributed across different populations? And then a strong emphasis on the natural environment, and the quality, whether that's biodiversity or clean air, clean water. Some frameworks are more anthropocentric than others, obviously, so the relative weight put on the environment depends. But I think that those are some common thematics that we're seeing in the movement.
Yeah, and what do they look like in practice? What's a specific example of a well-being economy approach to something like a development project or an issue that a community may be grappling with?
Yeah. So there are a lot of, I think, important examples. One of my favorites, maybe I'll just mention, there's a movement in Hawaii where they have a group of like Native Hawaiians have been putting forth a framework called the Aina Aloha Economic Futures sort of like initiative. And there's a framework where what they did was to articulate some core like Native Hawaiian values, like Indigenous values around or the importance of like we are of the Aina, right? So the supreme importance of clean air, clean water, of like protecting and healing our natural environment, principles that relate to our responsibilities as leaders coming from like our responsibility back to community. And so like these sort of relational dimensions. And what they did was they created like a spreadsheet, which is brilliant, an Excel spreadsheet, to make this like feel legitimate to maybe like Western, more mainstream colonial sort of thinkers, and to rank any economic development initiative project or proposal and on a scale of whether or not it's bad for Hawaii or positive for the systems change and overall, like well-being and environmental sustainability and regeneration of Hawaii. And that is an example, right? Like of the ways where once you have clarity on the principles, right? The things that really matter most. And then that becomes the criteria by which to evaluate your economic success as opposed to just a profit and loss log, right? Of how much money is this going to generate or how much is it going to cost which is the main way that we often assess um, economic initiatives.
Yeah, I love how it was made explicit. I mean, a spreadsheet, maybe it has advantages and disadvantages, limitations, right, for when you can use that sort of technology or approach, but to make it really explicit and to articulate as a community the collective principles, the purpose of the activity and then the economy as you described, that that process of doing that can be really generative and I feel like in the dialogue that happens, and I've seen this with other approaches to kind of moving away from the standard metrics of GDP and systems of national accounts, like the genuine progress indicator is an example. The number in the end for the GPI almost doesn't matter because it's the process of dialogue and collective articulating of values that I, in my experience, saw as really valuable. Also challenging because it's happening in the face of these systemic metrics and self-interest oriented pressures. So how did they do this in Hawaii in the face of the systems?
Yeah. Well, and I should say that this really emerged out of COVID and a massive economic crisis that was happening because of, Hawaii's economy is really dependent on tourism. And so it was a group of, like, yeah, Indigenous Hawaiians who wanted to be part of the thinking about economic recovery and were not included, and so therefore decided to take matters into their own hands and to spend time in deliberation around alternative vision for what to prioritize and how to genuinely allow for economic recovery to actually lead to a different system. And so there was a lot of discussions about that during COVID, right? Like the idea of like build back better, or, like how do we actually not just go back to the status quo, but utilize this opportunity in the same way that, after the financial crisis, in this country, we didn't change anything. But in Iceland, for example, they jailed the bankers and considered totally rewriting their constitution and had a massive sort of like feminist movement and shift in terms of their political representation that all really did lead to a significant restructuring of the economic system. And so I would say from my experience working with WEAll, I think the financial crisis like opened up a realization that we can't, the idea of just allowing free markets to do their thing is not a reasonable way to go about this. But then it was really COVID where I've seen such a massive acceleration of this movement across a wide variety of like countries and communities, because I think it was a breaking of our assumption that the future is going to look the same as the past has. And it really allowed a lot of people to sit and question, like, what's the purpose of life? Like, what are we doing? This sort of existential crises that we're in are always the foundations and the necessary preconditions for paradigm shift. And so I think we are in a moment of profound paradigm shift. It's not given which way that paradigm will go, but it's happening.
Let's explore that a little bit, because it does feel like in regards to well-being economies, there are paradigm shifts in terms of how we regard the land, how we regard the future and the past. Maybe thinking about ancestors and historical contributions to bringing us to where we are now, and thinking about discount rates, which are a thing in economics that assign a numerical value to how much we discount the future compared to the present, and is used in cost benefit analysis and net present value and all types of economic activities, but also a paradigm shift in how we regard ourselves in relationship to others and the land. It's a big question, but what are some of the notions that you're seeing begin to shift?
Mm. So I remember reading about like some rhetoricians, right, who would look at historically what were some of those signals of paradigm shift. And it tends to manifest, at least they were saying, in doubt and questioning of established institutions, truths, and even our identities and purpose. And so it's a really painful actual process, which I think we can see happening all around us, right? Like, like what's the purpose? Like, who are we? Who is legitimate authority? Why? I often, in my hopeful sort of moments, think that we're in a paradigm shift of moving from very like linear, mechanistic, hierarchical, and siloed ways of thinking and organizing things to more holistic, systemic, interconnected, and like compassionate forms. And so I think that's some of it, but it's hard because we have designed our institutions align with a certain way of compartmentalizing, siloing, categorizing, organizing. And so it's about building our capacities to really think in complexity and more systemically around these issues. I, yeah, I personally, I don't know if this is the time to talk about Karl Polanyi. Yeah,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
yeah, like probably the book that influenced me most is a book called The Great Transformation by Karl Polanyi. He was, and maybe defined as an economic anthropologist or an economic historian. And He was writing in the interwar period between World War I and World War II. And he spoke a lot about how the project of like capitalism, or what he calls like laissez-faire economics, like free market economics, was really a cultural project of a false commodification of people and nature and money. So to treat people and nature and money as if they're commodities when they're not really real commodities, and we can get into that in whatever meant. But what he was saying was there's only so long you could treat people like commodities that can just be like bought and sold or shifted or moved or, subject to threats of starvation unless they're working certain kinds of initiatives, etc., before they're going to revolt, pretty much. And so what he was calling it was a double movement, where he was seeing in his period a rise of fascism and communism as a mechanism by which people were trying to protect themselves from sort of the ravages of the market. And that idea of free market, laissez-faire capitalism was the animating force of neoliberalism. And so we're seeing that now at a global scale. And a similar counter movement of fascism, of people yearning for security and therefore looking for authority to try to protect themselves from perceived, you know what I mean? The threats to their livelihoods. And I think it is um, maybe overselling it to say that the well-being economy offers this alternative the way that communism was before. I don't think we're there yet, but I think we are in urgent need. And so the types of movements that are working to advance a different type of economic paradigm where our security and our ability to ensure our basic need fulfillment is not subject to our personal commodification, and that the nature and the earth is also not viewed as a commodity, are all part of, I think, that counter also paradigm shift, which I'm hoping will be strong enough to protect our demise. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm thinking about how much commodification as an act um, sort of reduces things in life to just materiality or to be
Mhm.
material only. And some aspects are, right? There are things. The economy is also about producing and sharing and distributing of things. And there is a material aspect. But there is a whole the whole of life includes a lot that is very difficult to measure or to think about in a linear mechanistic sort of way.
Mm-hmm.
What is it like to um, it almost feels like an obstacle to be in this world where many institutions in this country that we're both in have been designed out of the very linear mechanistic certain kind of worldview. And the institutions, as Indy Johar would point out, he was a guest on this forum last year. The institutions, in many ways, determine our default behaviors.
Mm-hmm.
We're we're attempting to shift the ways we're thinking and being and relating um, within systems that have been designed out of other mindsets or mindsets that we now are thinking about shifting. So there's a little bit of this isn't a question, it's just really like an observation of this obstacle that we're
Mm-hmm.
facing. Like paradigms can shift and paradigm often when we are attempting to shift them in large collective ways, the systems in place push back and resist, right?
Mm-hmm. 100%. I mean, I think this is something that like in our team and in the movement, we sit with a lot and maybe don't sit with enough even, but we are part of the systems we are critiquing, right? So we are, and I think it's important to recognize that we are not separate or superior to the realities of the systems that we are within. And so how to acknowledge and recognize that there is a lot about our current system that is really violent and destructive and extractive and exploitive. But there is also a lot that is in honoring, right, of our ancestors as well, that is built on a lot of wisdom experience. And so being able to differentiate what are the aspects that we do want to keep and what are the parts that are not of service of us, I think requires more than just like technocratic solutions, but a deeper reckoning, I guess, with wisdom and again of yeah, honoring both past and maybe future generations in some way. And but it's hard. It's hard. I think the thing that has struck me the most coming back to the US because I was living internationally for a long time is just a level of anxiety and depression here. Um, and and I'm grateful for spaces like this where we get to talk about more systemic issues, but the reality is that most of us are stuck in a state of just fight or flight. Like our nervous systems are so shot that our capacity to think long term or, outside the box and not just the realities of the defensiveness, like playing defense, especially in this particular day and moment, right? Or even to feel enough security that we can look and consider other species, other people, other types of ways of being. It is often, I think, felt like a privilege that is not available for most people at the particular moment. And so I think about it, maybe just grounding it for myself. Like I'm a single woman, right? Who lives in an apartment and in this the system, it is all on me to make sure that I earn enough money to ensure that I am able to fulfill my basic needs and save enough so that when I'm older, I can take care of myself, right? Like we've designed the system so that it's all on the individual because we can't trust that there's the informal cultural systems of maybe support or the formal state systems of support. And so it's the individualism, right, that is fed through our cultural mechanisms is also just the reality of the system we've designed too, where it's is on sort of like everybody individually. And that does re-perpetuate then that paradigm of seeming scarcity as opposed to like collective abundance.
Well, I want to go back to one thing you mentioned, which I really appreciate, which was about the learning and cultivating of capacities to think in different ways. So what I'm wondering about, what are some of those capacities? And building on what you were just saying, one capacity could be just the capacity to collaborate, to realize we're in this together, and to act in a way like we all, the acronym, right? We all are in this together. What are some of the other capacities that are needed these days for the current predicaments we face?
Mm. I mean, I think one of the most, for me, I guess I would say one of the most critical capacities is imagination. I think we're, especially when it comes to the economy, we are lacking in some imagination. And so, for example, there is such a strong emphasis because of the way that economics, especially since the 1950s, has evolved to be so highly quantitative that I think often we look to purely quantitative mechanisms for transformation of that system, or it's like validation, where if you had Indy maybe on, right? Like we have the capacity to really fundamentally question basic things like recognizing that the idea of a labor market is gross, right? Like that we have a market for people and that like why are we okay with that, right? Or that the idea um of the I think of, let's say, my own living in sort of like hypocrisy of I eat meat, but that's probably one of the areas that I feel most like sort of in misalignment morally, because I think we'll look back on the way we're treating animals with a lot of shame. And rather than viewing it as the way we do as children, right? With so much reverence and respect and sense of like kinship with animals, or even the idea of, I don't know, like in the US, I wrestle with this myself. Like I have an apartment that I rent and it makes me feel very insecure in terms of my housing. But owning a house, right? Like that is so embedded in this current system as essential and also a notion of the American dream and whatnot. But the notion of ownership of land and of property and whatnot is is insidious, I guess, to a lot of the problems that we have when it comes to the environment, and our idea of our relationship as the sort of owners of the things that are produced. There's a really great, I think a lot about quote that by Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, this is paraphrasing, but he was saying that the first person coming across a piece of land stuck his stake into the ground and said, "This is mine," and found people who were foolish enough to believe him, was the first founder of civil society. And he says, like, how many wars and horrors, crimes and brutalities would have been saved if somebody had said, "Don't listen to this fool," like pulled up the stake and said, "We are lost if we forget that the fruits of the earth belong to all of us and the earth itself to none." Right. And so what he's talking about is that whole enclosures movement, this idea that the earth and land as a commodity of a thing that can be privately owned, and therefore the fruits of it are therefore only for the owners of that space or system, is become so embedded within our current paradigm that I think often we're still trying to figure out a way to make this work, as opposed to imagining a very different way of organizing this system and our relationship with one another, and all life on this planet.
Yeah, one of those ways of reorienting could be around, not who does this land belong to, but uh, how do we belong with this land or in this land? And that idea, I think it was Kate Rayworth, who was another guest here last year, who mentioned ownership instead of ownership, which I
Mhm.
had to listen carefully that I heard it properly, but which I think was also maybe based on some work she and the Donut Economics Action Lab have been doing in Hawaii. The idea of being known to the land
Mhm.
and how that sort of relationship can reorient us to less of like an ownership model, less of property and commodification and materialization, and more of a reciprocal exchange and really responsibility.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think it is important to also acknowledge that, the ideas that are the foundation for a lot of what we would call like classical economists, or like since Adam Smith or of capitalism. This was happening during a time of colonialism, right? So a lot of this project comes from an intentional displacement and destruction of indigenous paradigms and communities and relations of people in place to the land, and movement of people away from that land so that you could also then create different types of racial hierarchies and legitimize slavery as a construct. And so a lot of the capital, let's say, that was extracted through the processes of colonization are viewed as just, a result of the ingenuity and intelligence of, like the Protestant work ethic or whatnot. But I think there was a recent study that showed just out of India, how much was it? $42 trillion. There was an estimate by a recent Indian economist, was extracted from India through colonization. And to put that amount in context, I think in 2018, the UK's GDP was only 3 trillion, right? So we're talking like massive extraction of wealth as the foundation for the type of, I don't know what you want to call prosperity that has been enjoyed across Europe or the US or other types of like colonial countries. And so that, yeah, that whole project begins, I think, with a lot of untold and unrecognized types of dynamics, that we are reckoning with, right? Like I think the global reparations movement, indigenous economics, indigenous rights movements, they're all part of this, yeah, this reckoning and also this paradigm, and giving us ideas of ways to make it right.
Yeah, I totally agree with that sense of like, yeah, what we're seeing and what's still happening. Just last year was hearing from an economist about this. Was such an interesting idea, I thought, to tally up all of the trade balances between the northern and the southern hemispheres in the planet, including development and aid funding and all of the balance sheets, and found that there's still a very large, I want to say trillions of dollars of flow just within the market economy from the south to the north.
Mm-hmm.
Add it all up, which I was like,
Yeah.
somebody did the
Jason
math.
Hickel found, I think it was 100 and I can't remember exactly, maybe $176 trillion has gone from the global south to the global north just since the 1960s. So post independence, you know? And so
Yeah.
like, this is a very, I studied with Ha-Joon Chang and Cambridge. And so he's very into industrial policy. And he was illustrating that the amount that developing countries pay out just for royalties every year exceeds the amount of international aid that goes in. And I was at an event recently at in Nashville that was held by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation around well-being. There was discussions of well-being economy, and they asked this question of how would it change if we genuinely felt responsibility to future generations and our ancestors? And the thing is, I think I've spent more time thinking about responsibility to future generations, but not so much the ancestors. And the first thing that came to my mind was if we really felt responsibility to our ancestors, we would never have intellectual property rights because you would realize that none of our ideas are our own. They are on the basis of so many other people's ideas for so long. And so the idea, the notion that you can own an idea, crazy, but it is a very strategic way. And that was a big thing in industrial policy worked on because I mean, we wanted to set up production in these countries, but we didn't want to allow them to actually reverse engineer the systems of production, which is why we implemented a whole system of an intellectual property right so that they wouldn't be allowed to. So we could take their resources or cheap labor without building their capacity to actually produce those things themselves. And so there's so much of just like general rigging within the current system that is going on. And for me working in an industrial policy, the thing I realized was there's so much desire and genuine effort to transform their economies, to produce more of their own things, to break out of these colonial trading patterns of just exporting raw materials or low value added agricultural products. But the reality is that they were too constrained by the global economic system and international financial architecture. And so then coming and working for WEAll, where I now work with like more rich, high income countries, yeah, it's been fascinating because I do think that we are the problem. And a lot of our existential crisis right now is good that we're going through this, but I don't think that we have the solutions to the issues we're facing. And so it's going to really take some humility to recognize that the paradigms and alternative cultural systems and that we are looking for that are the foundations for a different economic blueprint are going to be found elsewhere. And maybe that can be a foundation for reparations that comes not in the form of purely just a historical responsibility, but actually a recognition that what we need to learn, right? um, we need our capacities built in a different way, and we need to pay others for it.
Well put. Well, I'd love to turn towards the Q&A in just a moment. And on that note, wanted to also share a book that I've been reading lately, Robin Wall Kimmerer's new one, Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's a member of the Potawatomi Nation and a professor. And she describes how in this book, which just came out at the end of last year, she talks a lot about ecological economics and other forms of economies and talks about the gift economy. And just to quote her, the currency in a gift economy is relationship, which is expressed as gratitude, as interdependence, and the ongoing cycles of reciprocity. A gift economy nurtures the community bonds that enhance mutual well-being. The economic unit is we rather than I, as all flourishing is mutual.
Hmm. Mm.
What do you think
Well,
about that?
Posner is an amazing gift to this world. I love her so much. This is definitely one of my intellectual crushes. I would love to be able to hang out with her at some point. So if you can ever make that happen, Stephen, that'd be great. Um, but yeah, I think I think that notion of a gift economy is really huge. There's a book, The Gift, by this guy, Marcel Proust. I'm not pronouncing his last name right, but he was an anthropologist in the 1950s that was looking at a lot of more traditional, maybe traditional, I guess, kind of economic systems and really recognized that they were based in gift giving in a way that he hadn't anticipated, that the idea of being able to have access to different types of resources could be from other communities could be achieved through war or through sort of like an exchange. And most of it was done through gift-based exchanges as a way in which to build the trust and connections between communities. And there is interesting new or like neurological research that is showing very much that humans, the altruistic part of our brain is huge and it is very old. And when we engage in a process of gift giving, it boosts our immune systems, it reduces our stress levels, and it reinforces social trust within that relationship and also within our sense of social trust more generally. But that when we engage in a market transaction, which is seemingly very benign, right? Like we do it all of the time now. It has the opposite effect of increasing stress, reducing our immune systems, and reinforcing social distrust. And so, gift-based economies, like expanding the space for that, I think is one of the most essential ways, especially right now, that we can really build, I don't know, resistance, right? And to really lay foundations for a different type of system. And it's, maybe, I don't know. I'm hopeful that we can try to build more of that within any space that we live. Time banking, other types of mechanisms can be useful for that as well.
Wonderful. I'm going to turn to the Q&A and would love to invite anyone who's here today. Please share what questions are on your mind. The first one from Jennifer R. Where is degrowth in this version of the well-being economy?
Yes, loved the degrowth movement. I think they're fantastic and really, really, really important. So again, I would say WEAll, at least the Wellbeing Economy Alliance, was very much meant to sort of be a connector around a wide range of different movements and initiatives. I think the degrowth movement is very strong in Europe and is just starting to sort of spring up, I think, here in the US too. And I'm really happy about that because I think we're still very much fetishize growth. We like love growth. It doesn't really matter which party or spectrum you're kind of on. And recognizing that, yeah, like even here, I think a lot about the time poverty that people are facing and the ways in which the degrowth movement are illustrative of the power of slowing down, of really prioritizing like time and connection and different types of aspects of life rather than just continuous expansion, aggregate expansion for the point of it. So, yeah, great.
Yeah, I think the growth piece is really key, and thinking about how ecosystems grow and then reach a steady state, like an old growth forest, for example, and rather than accumulating more, there is enoughness. And what really happens over time, once a certain size is reached, is a deepening of the interconnections and the diversity within the ecosystem, right? Um,
Yeah.
Here's a very nice practical question for everybody from Adam K. Other than some of the books already recommended, what steps do you recommend folks take to increase their literacy with and participation in well-being economies?
Mm, yeah. Well, I would definitely recommend check out WEAll.org. That's like the website, and you can join as a member. That's how I started. So I was working at the African Development Bank, and was very neoliberal. I was very struggling. So I joined as just a member and a volunteer and really felt like I had found my community in that way. And that's how I ended up. Eventually, there was a job opportunity, and I ended up joining and working for WEAll as a economics and policy lead. But I think that's a really like practical first step. I think in terms of like literature on it. One thing, again, coming back to the point of the distinction between well-being economy and economics. Well-being
Mhm.
economics itself is a sort of disciplinary field of study, and it was very much inspired by Amartya Sen, and like the capabilities approach. And, Amartya Sen has a PhD in economics and philosophy, so he's just brilliant, right? Like he's an absolute brilliant man. So very much, I think, worth a read. Whereas I think the well-being economy movement, often just practically in terms of steps, it's about one, coming together, like building community of multi-stakeholders, right? Like recognizing that the solutions we seek are not going to come just from academia or business or government or civil society advocacy. Like it's going to require all of us to sort of come together in some way to engage in community around gaining clarity on what do we mean by a good life? What is our vision that we are trying to achieve, to have clarity on sort of that well-being vision or however you want to define it. And then taking that next step of then thinking about, okay, well, what are the ways that we are producing and providing for one another currently that is in support of that vision? And what are aspects of that system that we need to be transformed in order to be of better alignment? And I recognize, we're all interconnected now globally, right? So this change needs to happen at all levels. There are things that have to happen at the global level to make space for more self-determination at the national changes that need to happen to make more space at the state or local, etc. But I don't know. I am somebody who believes in like let a thousand flowers bloom, and let's just be in connection with one another and be stronger than the sum of our parts.
Love that. And I would just add a few that just very quickly that are coming to mind. Samantha Power is doing a lot of interesting work around bioregional finance and bioregional regeneration. I think that's another area that is growing these days and a lot of energy there. Another one is the Schumacher Center for New Economics. I think a lot of great work coming out of there around the commons and the common good and community-based approaches to being in relationship with land. And then ecological economics is a whole field in itself that I would say is well-being economies and ecological economics are like siblings or relatives within the same space. And Herman Daly is somebody who's written a lot on these kinds of topics in the past. One other question here. I'm going to bundle a couple of these from Meg and from Michelle. Wasn't sure if this would come up, but obviously we talked about maybe discussing this. Here we are in the first week of a new administration, considering the latest government that is in place in the US here. What are some next immediate steps to maintain what has been gained? And, what kind of efforts are effective currently within the US economy at shifting the system?
Mm. Oh my goodness. This is definitely the question of the day.
We
Yeah.
didn't kill the last
And
few minutes. Sorry about
yeah,
that.
no. And you know, I honestly I can't say that I have the answer. I can tell you what like sort of the strategy I'm trying to take in this moment is. I don't know if it's right or wrong, but a lot of the focus for me has been on identifying state level economic systems change networks like the Aina Aloha Economic Futures in Washington State. They've been doing a lot around transforming systems of governance to really center, like develop long-term well-being strategies, poverty alleviation strategies by actually centering people who have are in poverty or experiencing poverty, which itself is a big paradigm shift because as we can see nationally, we have this idea that rich people are the legitimate sort of rulers, or at least have the best insights on how we should design economic policy. And I think we need to really flip that narrative, right? And flip that in a different way. In some ways, I feel like I'm a Republican now, just so psyched that states have rights relative to the federal government. So, like, working at that level, working at the community level, I'm I just joined the ACLU board here in Vermont, like personally, because I don't have a background in civil liberties. And I really do think we need to keep laying foundations for like hopeful alternative economic systems, but also be prepared to engage in a lot more defense and immediate protection of vulnerable communities at this moment. But I don't know. I think the more that we can showcase examples, hopeful examples at this moment and shine a light on them, I think that that's critical, as well as being, yeah, realistic and sticking in there. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Is well put. Yeah. Amanda, thank you so much for joining us today, and for such an enlightening and alive conversation. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks, Stephen, and thank you all so much. I'm sorry I didn't get a chance to like properly see and engage with you all, but I'm so grateful for you giving the time. And yeah, I look forward to being colleagues and comrades in this movement moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll see you back in Vermont before long. And we are thinking about different formats for these kinds of forums in 2025. So perhaps we could have one where it's a roundtable format or a more
Mm,
interactive online forum.
yeah.
Um, and then briefly, just a reminder for everybody that all of these forums are offered free of charge. So if you would like to support our programming, please consider going to our website and clicking the donate button to make a contribution. And please visit our website calendar for a full list of upcoming programs next week. There's an evening session with my colleague, Dr. Angel Acosta, on the Garrison Institute Fellowship. Love Angel's work. And then next month, we'll begin a program with Dr. Bayo Akomolafe that includes an online course and an in-person retreat when he'll return here to the Garrison Institute in April. And I'll be
Mm.
joining that. I encourage others to consider it as well.
Yeah, bio is a genius, so definitely highly recommend. Yeah.
Agree. Yeah. We hope you can join us again soon, and bye for now.
Bye, everyone. Hang in there.